We have reports of the phenomenon known as a near-death experience from many different cultures, from different time periods, different places around the world, including ancient Greece and Rome. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to a few of the reports of near-death experiences from ancient Greek and Roman writers. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I explore myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. And so today, NDEs in the ancient world. I was inspired to talk about this topic by my PhD student Gregory Shushan. Gregory actually already has a PhD in a different topic. I'm supervising him because he hasn't studied ancient Greece and Rome before, but he is an expert in near-death experiences, and he has 2 books out on them already, which I will link to below. I own them as ebooks, otherwise I would wave them at you, but they are called The Next World, Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife, and Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions. So the collection of texts I've pulled together today is from Gregory's research into ancient Greek and Roman reports of near-death experiences. He will eventually, of course, be publishing that research, but he's still writing the PhD at the moment, so this is a work in progress. I'm just talking you through some of the primary sources, with just a brief discussion of the relationship they bear with near-death experiences from other cultures. Although near-death experiences in the Western world have a fairly typical pattern, often involving an out-of-body experience where people often feel like they're floating above their body and then moving through a dark tunnel towards a light, there is actually a lot of variation in reports of near-death experiences from different times and places around the world. The tunnel in particular is, oddly enough, a fairly modern Western-specific variant. And then there's other things. People often see the spirits of dead people or a religious being. Some near-death experiences can be unpleasant. That's a very small percentage. So basically, of the people who come very close to death, so this is usually a cardiac arrest or a severe head injury, a coma, or a very threatening situation, mountaineers experiencing accidents in the mountains, near drowning, this kind of thing. Of that kind of situation where the human body is near to death, about 10% of people have a near-death experience, and of those, a very small percentage can include an unpleasant experience, which is usually described as hellish in the literature after the Christian concept of hell. It doesn't mean you have to be Christian to have that experience, and as we'll see, the ancient pagan Greeks and Romans often described something that we would call hellish. It's the easiest way to get across that sense of often a dark chasm, suffering, wailing, that kind of thing. Wailing and gnashing of teeth, basically, and a fall into a dark chasm. You don't have to be Christian to experience that kind of thing, but calling it hellish is the easiest shorthand to describe it. But there is a lot of cross-cultural variation, and they are partly culturally defined. Like modern Western people being more likely to experience a tunnel, the bright light is more common across different times and places. They can also be experienced by people in deep states of meditation or in states of extreme fear, even if the body itself is not in immediate danger or is not kind of shutting down or experiencing some kind of physical issue. But extreme fear of death at a particular moment or deep meditation can also bring about this type of experience. More rarely. Because there is so much variation, in 1983, Bruce Greyson suggested an NDE scale, so NDE, near-death experience. This is now often called the Greyson scale. It consists of 16 questions to ask people who have had an experience that might be considered an NDE to establish whether it counts as an NDE or not. And you get 0, 1 or 2 points for each answer. For example, did you see deceased spirits or religious figures? You get 2 points if the answer is you saw them, 1 point for sensed their presence without seeing them, and 0 points for neither. And anybody who gets 7 points or above, their experience is counted as an NDE. Like the experience of sensed presence, where people have a feeling of somebody behind them or with them, or hear a voice from somebody they can't see in cases of extreme danger usually, NDEs are a recognised phenomenon. How people explain them has a lot of variation. Some people explain them in a spiritual way, relate them to their religious beliefs. Some people explain them as the effect on the brain of extreme trauma, as some kind of physical effect on the brain, because most of them take place when the body is often clinically dead for a short period of time or under severe duress. Some people explain them psychologically, especially considering they can be induced by meditation sometimes. So there's lots of different ways to explain the phenomenon depending on your point of view, or indeed you could combine multiple explanations. I'm someone who often thinks that the spiritual and the physical and biological and medical go together. That's just me. But regardless of what you think causes them, they are a recognisable phenomenon. They are reported nearly everywhere, with the exception of some cultures where to talk about death, and particularly to talk about nearly dying, is taboo. So of course in those cultures people don't describe them. That of course doesn't mean they don't happen. It means they don't talk about them. The 16 criteria that define an NDE on the Greyson scale are: time sped up, thoughts sped up, scenes from the person's past came back to them, suddenly they seem to understand everything, a feeling of peace or pleasantness, a feeling of joy, a feeling of a sense of harmony with the universe, being surrounded by brilliant light, senses more vivid than usual, they're aware of things happening elsewhere, so things happening on Earth elsewhere than where they are. Scenes from the future came to them, a sort of a flash forward or a prophecy of some kind, separation from the physical body or an out-of-body experience, entering another world, encountering a mystical being or presence, seeing deceased spirits or religious figures, and reaching a border or point of no return. However, other scholars have produced variations on the specific criteria over the years. Not every scholar, whether they are a doctor, a psychiatrist, a theologian, a historian, not everybody uses the same criteria. For example, Marinus van der Sluijs, who has studied ancient Greek and Roman near-death experiences, uses a combination of several other scholars' versions to produce his own checklist. It's also a checklist of 16, but it's slightly different. His 16 criteria for something being a near-death experience are: difficulty to describe what has been seen afterwards, awareness of being dead, an out-of-body experience, a strange sound when you have an out-of-body experience. People often report a whirring sound. The absence of pain, particularly obviously since many people experiencing this have been close to death for whatever reason. Passage towards a bright light, that may include a tunnel or may not. Observation of an otherworldly beautiful landscape. He also includes hellish experience, which is a very small proportion of NDEs, although as you'll see a much larger proportion of Greek and Roman NDEs. But he includes that as a potential facet of an NDE. Encounter with deceased people, often including relatives or friends. Encounter with a being of light or a guide. A life review, so that's your life flashing before your eyes. A flash forward, so images of scenes from the future or a prophecy. Experience of a boundary that you can't pass. Forced return. Conscious return to the body. And afterwards, a changed lifestyle. Many people who have a near-death experience find their lives profoundly changed by that experience and have kind of noticeable changes in their character and outlook afterwards. We get a good sense of the basic pattern of a Greco-Roman near-death experience from the story of Cleonymus of Athens, a philosopher. The story is preserved by a late writer called Proclus, who wrote commentaries way off in the 5th century CE. He's often writing about stories that take place centuries, even 1,000 years earlier than he is writing. So it's a very, very old story. But this is pretty much the template of Greco-Roman near-death experience reports. Cleonymus of Athens, the philosopher, fell into unconsciousness once as a consequence of a terrible fright. They thought him dead and arranged his funeral. On the 3rd day, however, as his mother was bewailing him, he woke up and relayed what he had seen in the beyond. His soul was set free from his prison and gently rose, and he had seen regions that no other eye had seen before. At the end, he found himself in the holy enclosure of Hestia, where incredibly beautiful female angels were floating. Proclus is quite a late writer, hence his use of the word angel, which you wouldn't usually see in a pagan text. Over there, he met another immortal soul, and a voice called out to him, "Stay there and observe." Then he saw the punishment there, the pain and the purification of diverse souls, and the terrible Eumenides, that's the Furies, as wardens attended to their offices. In departing, both he and his friend exchanged words that when they succeeded in returning to Earth again, they would visit one another. And indeed, when one of them, Lysias of Syracuse, visited Athens and Cleonymus recognised his heavenly comrade, he greeted him. So we can see here an out-of-body experience with that recognisable sense of floating upwards from the body. An otherworld. There is also a hellish area, as we'll see. This is a usual component of Greco-Roman near-death experiences in particular. He meets another spirit, albeit one of somebody else alive, who is also having a near-death experience at the same time as him, and then he returns to his body. And this is the basic template of accident or illness, person is near death, out of the body, travelling to another world. There's beauty and a wonderful, joyous landscape, but also an area where the wicked are being punished that you can see. There's other people there, and then a forced return to the body. The best known report of a near-death experience from Greek and Roman literature is Plato's account of the myth of This is a philosophical story, so most of the detail in Plato's account is not meant to be a literal account of somebody's real life lived experience. It is a metaphor, it's a parable to explain Plato's philosophy. The story is included at the end of Plato's Republic, which is about the ideal city-state, and it's about justice and many other philosophical ideas about life, the afterlife, and justice and divine punishment, and it's very, very complex. There's an awful lot to it. I am not going to go through all the philosophical aspects of the myth of I'm really interested in it, particularly as it relates to near-death experiences. And really, the near-death experience here is basically a framing device for Plato's discussion of the afterlife and of justice and so on. But it does incorporate real elements that are recognisable from other reports of near-death experiences, from other people, from other times and places, including, of course, modern ones, where we can actually talk to the person who's had the experience, unlike with the ancient world. So it may have been inspired by real accounts of near-death experiences. It may even have been inspired by a real person who had a near-death experience, and Plato may have just massively expanded the story for his own purposes. According to Plato, is a soldier who was killed in battle, but his body did not rot, and then when he was put on a funeral pyre on the 12th day, he woke up and told everyone what he had seen at great length. Sluijs has suggested that references to his soul going forth from his body and then returning to his body suggest an out-of-body experience. Possibly, I should point out that in ancient Greek myth, it is usual to envisage the soul flying out of the body at the point of death. And you can even see on some Greek vases, the person who's dying is usually Sarpedon from the Trojan War, and you can see this tiny little minifigure with wings that's flying out of the body, and that's his soul, his psyche, flying off to the afterlife. So that description doesn't necessarily indicate an out-of-body experience in the sense we would expect, although it could. Not all scholars have accepted that these are related to real-life NDEs. Jan Bremmer is particularly sceptical about whether a lot of these relate to real-life NDEs. However, there are other elements as well. Experiences a bright light. He travels to an otherworldly landscape. There is that hellish area, which is pretty much always a feature of these Greco-Roman examples. He sees the spirits of deceased people, and he encounters a boundary he cannot cross. Sluijs also connects the judgment of the dead that witnesses with the life review, or your life flashing before your eyes, often found in near-death experiences. The life review can be accompanied by a feeling of judgment on how good or bad your actions have been in your life. Again, I'm a little bit less convinced by that because I think that this, in Plato, the judgment of the souls, which doesn't happen to he sees it happening to other people because he's not dead yet. And I think that's really more to do with Plato's philosophical point in this text than anything to do with your life flashing before your eyes in a near-death experience. But it is another interesting connection. If we include that and the out-of-body experience, that's 8 out of Sluijs's 16 elements. So it certainly does seem to include some real elements from real-life NDEs that Plato has then adapted and used in the philosophical metaphor he's developing. It's also a big influence on Plutarch's story about Timarchus of Chaeronea, a character who is not known from any other histories, but who was supposedly a friend of Socrates' son Lamprocles, and who had a very similar near-death experience when he went to consult the incubation oracle of Trophonius. This is a very mysterious oracle in central Greece. An incubation oracle is where you go and you sleep in the sanctuary and you pray for a dream. They're often healing sites, so you're often praying for a cure of some kind. You're often praying for the god to either tell you what to do to cure a disease or injury, or to cure you in the dream. The Oracle of Trophonius doesn't seem to have been a healing site specifically. It seems to have had more of a connection with oracles of the dead, where you descend underground to try and contact the souls of the dead. You're trying to kind of get closer to the underworld. And it seems to have been a bit of a combination of the two. And according to Plutarch, this person called Timarchus went to consult the Oracle of Trophonius, got hit on the head, and then had an out-of-body experience where he sees the heavenly spheres, he sees a hellish area, he sees people, the spirits of other people, and it's also an extended philosophical metaphor. And I covered this in my latest episode of the podcast, Creepy Classics. So my other channel on YouTube, you can listen to my podcast episodes there, or you can listen to it on Substack, or on Apple, or on Spotify. So if you're interested, do go and listen to that. I retell ancient, medieval, and early modern ghost stories, and then I have a historical discussion of them. And the story that I retold for the latest episode was the story of Timarchus and his near-death experience. So I talked a lot more in detail about that particular text over there on Creepy Classics. Probably the closest Greco-Roman example in terms of similarity with modern near-death experiences is another one from Plutarch. Quite a lot of these stories come from Plutarch. Partly that's because Plutarch wrote a lot, and he was quite religious. He was a priest at the Oracle of Delphi. He was initiated into at least one mystery cult, and he's very interested in the spiritual and the religious. So he likes to record things like this, and he's also left us an enormous amount of writing, both philosophy and biography. So it is interesting what a proportion of Greek and Roman near-death experience reports come from Plutarch. Another one comes from Plutarch's text on the delays of divine vengeance, from his philosophical texts, often known as the Moralia. According to Plutarch, a man called Aridaeus had been living a rather naughty life, but sometime after 81 CE, he went to the Oracle of Amphilochus, which is another incubation oracle, this one is in Turkey, modern Turkey I should say, to see if he should mend his ways. The oracle said things would improve for him in death. Not long after the trip to the oracle, he fell from a precipice onto his neck. After 3 days, his family were about to bury him when he suddenly recovered. The experience left him a changed man, and he changed his name to Thespesius. This is a name which means wondrous one and has since been given to a dinosaur. Thespesius said he felt like he was flung out to sea, which sounds like it could be an out-of-body experience, an OBE. He was taken to an otherworldly place with bright lights. There was also a great chasm. There were people being punished in another part of this other world. He sees the spirits of deceased people. He is given a prophecy of his own death, which connects with that flash-forward scenes from the future that's often a part of near-death experiences. He came up against a boundary, and he experienced the return to his body and was definitely a changed person afterwards, and resolved to live a better life. And van der Sluijs once again also connects him seeing people being judged with the life review or life flashing before your eyes. Again, I'm not 100% convinced by that connection, but I can see where he's going with that. So, by van der Sluijs's reckoning, the vision of Thespesius scores an impressive 14 out of 16 of the core elements of an NDE. This is van der Sluijs's specific set of elements rather than the Greyson scale, and it does depend on whether you think that the life review corresponds to the judgment and that kind of thing. But still, this is probably the closest to modern near-death experience reports from the ancient texts. But you can see they are all very, very similar. This is partly why Jan Bremmer tends to think they're not real near-death experiences. He thinks they're more of a literary trope, and they are. They're a bit of both. There is a clear literary aspect to these. They're appearing in texts of philosophy. They are supposed to teach people something. They're parables, they're metaphors. But they also include all of these elements that we know correspond to real-life near-death experiences. So again, what seems likely is that Plutarch knows of people who have had these experiences. He knows what is typical of these experiences. Thespesius may even be a real person. We don't really know. He has a fairly specific kind of 2 names and a date that he lives, which isn't too long before Plutarch's own lifetime. So he may be a real person, And some of this may be elements of real experience, but then it has been elaborated upon and literary elements added. The fact that every single time there's like a chasm and people being punished would suggest that that's more to do with Greco-Roman beliefs about the afterlife and about the souls of the wicked being punished in Tartarus, while the souls of the not wicked go somewhere joyous or are reincarnated through the process of metempsychosis, where they are reborn in another body. Those are philosophical beliefs about the afterlife from the ancient world, and it seems pretty clear that some of these descriptions are describing those beliefs, especially since the hellish experience is reported in a very small number of real-life near-death experiences, and it's usually one or the other. Of modern near-death experiences where we can talk to the person that had the experience, I think is what I'm saying. We can't talk to these ancient people, and none of these are written down by the person who had the experience. They're all reported many years later at second hand, sometimes centuries later. So usually, from direct reports of near-death experiences, people tend to experience either the scary, hellish experience or, much more often, the pleasant, joyful experience surrounded by bright light. We also have several ancient reports of people dying and coming back to life who don't say what happened to them, so it's hard to categorise them as a near-death experience because we don't have any detail. All we have is, well, they nearly died and then they came back. So they may have had a near-death experience, or they may not. Not everybody does. Sometimes it's specifically mentioned that they couldn't tell people what happened, or they were forbidden from telling people what happened. Yet another one from Plutarch, he does specifically say happened to a friend of his. So this is a real story about a real person who Plutarch knew. His friend Antyllus apparently died and then was set free again, as Plutarch puts it, but he doesn't provide any more detail. Another one by Proclus, who also is somebody we have heard from before, a collector of ancient near-death experiences. Proclus mentioned a 4th century CE man, so about a century before his own lifetime, called Marinus of Nicopolis, who was buried and revived 15 days later, who said he saw and heard many wonderful things under the earth, but had been ordered not to describe them. By the time Proclus is writing, Christianity is the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. All other religions had been outlawed at the end of the 4th century. At the time that would have happened to Uranus, that wouldn't be the case, but Christianity was becoming more and more popular because the emperors were Christian. So that may have something to do with some of these later examples not describing exactly what happened, and particularly in Uranus's case, if he's maybe pagan, he doesn't want to describe a pagan afterlife if it is becoming increasingly kind of contentious to be pagan. It was about 384, the emperor at the time, Emperor Theodosius, outlawed all religions other than Christianity. So probably, if that happened to Uranus in the middle of the 4th century, paganism wouldn't be illegal yet, but it may be that that's why he didn't want to talk about it, if he had an experience of what would be expected of a pagan Greco-Roman afterlife rather than a Christian one. Although, as you've seen, there are many similarities because, of course, Christianity starts in the Roman Empire. Jesus was Jewish and his early disciples are Jewish, but then they convert lots of pagan Romans and lots of people interested in Greek and Roman philosophy. So the philosophies of Stoicism and Platonism are heavy influences on the development of Christianity. So there is a reason that these pagan afterlives sound so similar to Christian concepts of heaven and hell, because the Christian concepts come partly from Jewish theology, but also partly from Greco-Roman philosophy. The idea of a near-death experience was common enough in the ancient world to be satirized. In the 2nd century CE, the Greek writer Lucian of Samosata, in his text Lover of Lies, had a section making fun of this type of story. In Lucian's text, Cleodemus the philosopher says, "I had been ill and Antigonus here was attending me. The fever had been on me for 7 days, was now aggravated by the excessive heat. All my attendants were outside, having closed the door and left me to myself. I woke to find a handsome young man standing at my side in a white cloak. He raised me up from the bed and conducted me through a sort of chasm into Hades. I knew where I was at once because I saw Tantalus and Titius and Sisyphus." These are people being punished with eternal punishments by the gods for terrible crimes. Tantalus is the one who can never quite reach the grapes, even though he's desperately hungry. Sisyphus is the one who has to roll a rock up a hill forever. Not to go into details, I came to the judgment hall, and there were Aeacus and Charon and the Fates and the Furies. One person of a majestic appearance, Pluto I suppose it was, sat reading out the names of those who were due to die, their term of life having lapsed. The young man took me and set me before him, but Pluto flew into a rage. "Away with him," he said to my conductor. "His thread is not yet out. Go and fetch Demolus the smith. He has had his spindle full and more." I ran off home, nothing loath. My fever had now disappeared, and I told everybody that Demolus was as good as dead. He lived close by and was said to have some illness, and it was not long before we heard the voices of mourners in his house. What I find interesting about this is there's very little here that matches modern near-death experience reports from people who have had them. There's no out-of-body experience, there's no bright light, there's no strange noise, there's not even much of a forced return to the body. He kind of runs home. And I think what Lucian is satirising here is the literary elements. I don't think that's necessarily conscious on Lucian's part even. Lucian is quite sceptical about most things, and he loves tearing apart mythology. But I think it's interesting that the parts that he has picked upon to make fun of are the parts that are more to do with Greco-Roman myth and literature. The idea of the judgment hall, the idea of being judged, of Pluto, of the fates are there, the mythological figures of Tantalus and Sisyphus. These are all aspects of Greco-Roman mythology, specifically of some Greco-Roman afterlife belief. But there's not much that relates to actual near-death experiences, although in the other texts we did see that. So I wonder if this is because Lucian is not particularly familiar with real-life reports of near-death experiences, but is just making fun of the literary trope, and he's picked up on the mythological literary aspects, and he's just not interested in the aspects of those stories that were actually replicating and referring to people's real experiences. Or he's done it on purpose, and Lucian is very deliberately not making fun of people's real experiences, whatever the cause of them. He's making fun of the literature, not the people. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a like. If you'd like to support the channel, the best way to do that is to... Oh, the book's gone. Please do buy my book, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome. There's definitely at least one from Plutarch in here. Plutarch liked ghost stories too. I have retold ancient Roman ghost stories. There's a short author's note at the back. They are retold in a modern format. You can get that in paperback or ebook from Amazon, and it's in Kindle Unlimited. And if you would like book news as it comes out, because there will be a second volume coming out this spring, then you can sign up to my newsletter on Substack, and you also can get the podcast through there too. And until next time, thank you for watching. Bye!